Welcome to our latest session in our series on Marxism. Is it still relevant? Yes. Tonight, Kevin Bean will be looking at the question of socialists and their relationship to parliament, and I believe participation in bourgeois government, but I might have gotten that wrong, that he's looking at that question as well, but it certainly would be an interesting question when we look back at our experience with Jeremy Corbyn, etc. Could he have delivered socialism or a socialist government, as so many people had hoped? It will be, I'm sure, one of the things that come up in discussion at least. Welcome, Kevin.
Okay, thanks, Tina, and good evening, comrades. Tina has introduced the session, and it will, of course, talk about parliamentarism, a relationship between socialism and parliament, and the debates in the labour movement on that question. But it's also, in a way, a bit of a summing up for some of the sessions that we've had before, particularly on the nature of socialist politics in Marx and Engels' time. But I will also touch a little bit on Lenin, although I'm very well aware that obviously there's a further debate really about Lenin and the Russian Revolution, which, as Tina says, is likely to come up in our next set of sessions. So that's really what I want to look at this evening. The debate about Parliament and about whether there's a parliamentary road to socialism has been one that has really engaged the labour movement and indeed Marxists really from the beginning. And one of the things that I was trying to put across, particularly when I talk about Marxism and democracy, is that both Marx and Engels, when they were developing their political ideas, drew their ideas on political practice initially from the experience of the Chartist movement, which they described as the world's first working class movement. This was a mass movement for the right to vote. It involved protest meetings, it involved organization, it involved petitions, strikes, demonstrations, and indeed in certain places, insurrectionary movements. Comrades who were in last year's sessions will remember that Rob Sewell gave a talk on the Chartist movement, and he drew that lesson out very clearly. So what I really want to look at is specifically on the question of Parliament, but maybe the role of Parliament and perhaps the sort of nature of Marxist politics, the idea of the political in Marxism. And that, of course, is, as I said, drawn from the experience of Marx and Engels, both with the Chartist movement, but then as the 19th century progresses, with other movements, the 1848 revolutions in Europe and the aftermath, their attempts at establishing a communist organization, the Communist League, then their role in the First International Working Men's Association, and then the other campaigns in Britain, and then later on in other countries for the right to vote. But of course, the impact of the Commune, which we looked at again very recently, the importance of the Commune in shaping Marx's understanding of the nature of the transition to socialism, and indeed the relationship of socialists to the state. So all of these experiences fed in to Marx and Engels' work. But to go back to the beginning, and particularly the type of ideas that are outlined in the Communist Manifesto, which is in many senses the first summary of Marx and Engels' ideas, what is brought together there, and what will emerge more clearly, is the idea of the working class as an independent political force. That is not as an appendage to any other force, not, for example, as an appendage to liberalism, not as an appendage, even in some countries, to feudal socialism or the aristocracy. So the idea of working class independence is quite central. So from that, and the idea of the working class being the revolutionary class, there then arises a number of political consequences, I think. And that, of course, is then on the issue of organization. How does the working class organize itself? And indeed, what is the political task, rather the political aims and functions of the working class? In the inaugural address of the First International, which was written by Marx, he says, "To conquer political power has become the duty of the working class." And the significance of that statement in that address is that Marx very clearly establishes the idea of political power, not just economic power, which obviously is important, the economic power of the working class as the proletariat, but making politics and making the political the instrument of working class power. Now, you might think that that's sort of fairly self-evident, but remember that the idea of conquering power and of making the working class a political subject, in other words, the working class taking society into its own hands, was something that Marx and Engels were very keen developing from the experience of Chartism. But they had to also polemicize against that, as we can see when we look at the Communist Manifesto. There were many people who claimed to be socialists and communists who argued for a much different, a very different model of socialism. So the focus on the political is the idea that this will involve a political struggle, it will involve a conscious struggle, and it will be a struggle for power in society. So that the transformation of society will not be conducted by any elements of the existing order. For example, in the Communist Manifesto, it refers to feudal socialists. It talks about certain sections of the ruling classes, adapting to change, and indeed others advocating a type of feudal socialism in which the basic social order remains intact. But it's also a polemic against those people who believe that socialism would be introduced either by a benevolent ruling class or again as part of a reformation, a reformation of existing society. So, for example, there would have been in all the countries of Europe, it's particularly true in Britain and France, social reformers who believed that they had a sort of model form of socialism, and that they would then simply persuade the rulers that this was a good plan for the reorganization of society. This was philosophically and politically very idealistic. And Marx and Engels really polemicized against this idea, arguing that not only would this not be possible, that the existing rulers would not would not allow this, would not change society in that way, but all that would essentially happen would be new forms of authority, new forms of power, and that for a truly human form of emancipation and generalized freedom, this would involve the working class as the universal class taking political power. So you can already see that before we get anything like Marxist politics, in particular in terms of organized groupings and developed theories, at the very first sort of glimmerings of these ideas focuses on the working class independent organization, but also says that the task of emancipation, which is that of the working class, will be general emancipation, and that it isn't just a case of appealing to the established order to carry out change in that way. So those elements then raise the question of how will the working class achieve this function? How will this be done? Well, again, to look at the phrases which are being developed, they might appear to be rather cliched now. I mean, they're repeated so often, but if we consider them, I think we can see that they really do have, important implications. Again, from the rules this time of the First International, the emancipation of the working class must be organized and must be conquered by the working class themselves. In other words, that this is not a function of the bourgeoisie, of the aristocracy, or anybody else. The importance of the commune in 1870 was again this idea of conscious political subjectivity by the working class. And it was here that, again, as I've discussed before, that Marx really began to develop the idea that the existing state could not simply be a ready-made instrument. You know, the working class simply cannot lay hold of the ready-made state machinery and wield it for its own purpose. And that, again, is not just because this machinery is not suitable, but because the state itself is a form of capitalist power. It's an institution of capitalist power, and as such, it isn't neutral. That it as a mechanism, as an organism, its job is to maintain the status quo. So it isn't the case of simply placing socialists or communists or revolutionaries, rather like in the seat of a car and driving the car, pointing it in a particular direction. This is very much a machine that has a mind of its own, and its mind is that of supporting the status quo. Indeed, in other writings on the state, particularly in relation to Germany and also in relation to the revolutionary movements of 1848, both Marx and Engels argue that the state itself has, in many senses, its own interests as well. This was particularly developed when Marx looked at Louis Napoleon Bonaparte's regime in the 1850s and the 1860s. So the commune, in a sense, proved to Marx and Engels, that we couldn't simply take hold of that machinery. So where does Parliament fit into that? Parliament is clearly part of that state machinery, and as such, would presumably not be a ready-made instrument. So why did Marx and Engels put so much importance on Parliament, and why did parliamentary struggle, and indeed the idea of what Lenin calls revolutionary parliamentarianism, why was it so important, both as a form of debate and a topic of debate, but also, I think, of a symbol of a particular conception of politics? Well, the important role of parliaments, both in countries which were undergoing bourgeois revolutions, or indeed countries which had had a measure of democratic reform and change, was simply that they presented a political forum. We, I think, tend to take parliament and representative democracy very much at face value, or we simply take it for granted. Now, the fact that large numbers of people today don't follow intimately parliamentary politics, they don't avidly follow the debates, many people don't bother to vote, and it seems to be an institution and a type of politics which is really remote from us. Now, probably one of the penalties of growing older is a certain tendency to golden ageism. And I can remember a time when speeches in Parliament, when parliamentary oratory, when comments and so on, were avidly followed by Labour movement activists. If any comrades here want to sort of see the merit of that, just look at the Labour movement's papers. Just look, for example, at even standard newspapers, which would, a newspaper like the Times or the Guardian or the Telegraph, would have devoted a whole broadsheet page to the goings on in Parliament. So what we now, in a sense, almost take for granted, and in many ways we think of as relatively unimportant, was historically very important. It was very important because of its revolutionary connotations. Remember that representative democracy in pre-revolutionary Europe, in the Europe of the French Revolution, in the Europe of 1848, was the center of politics. It was a concentrated form. It was, in a sense, the nation coming together. That was really the idea of representative democracy. And of course, in the United States, which had the most democratic regime in the world at the time, this was again embodied in the electoral system. So for revolutionary Democrats, and of course for socialists, Parliament was something to aspire to. It was something that would be, a political objective. It wasn't seen, for example, as simply, part of the scenery. In societies where few people had the right to vote, where power was concentrated in the hands of monarchs, then the demands for a democratic republic or for forms of democracy were really very revolutionary demands. And so for Marx and Engels and for others in the 1840s and the 50s and the 60s, getting those things was important. But of course, they were posed as ends in themselves. They were seen as the political platform from which workers could then advance politically. Now, that may seem a relatively reformist set of politics. It may seem that this is a sort of conquest of change bit by bit. Now, that I think is inaccurate for two reasons. One, because the ruling class was generally very unwilling to surrender any aspects of its power. So the demands for parliamentary representation were generally seen as challenges to the existing order. But even in those societies where parliamentary rights had been given, and where, for example, as in the case of Louis Napoleon in France, or even more so Bismarck in the Second Reich, the German Empire that comes into existence after 1870, or indeed even in the North German Confederation before that, there is a considerable degree of parliamentary activity. The Reich that Bismarck establishes has the right to vote for all adult males over 25, and although there's no parliamentary accountability, it is a political forum. So not only is the struggle for parliamentary rights and for democracy revolutionary in that context, it also draws attention to the idea of the working class being the dominant, or potentially being the dominant class. In other words, it is a battleground, a place where politics can be concentrated. And of course, in the case of the movements that I talked about both in these series and earlier, socialists did get into parliament and use it exactly in that way. Marx and Engels, but also Lenin, point to the example of the German Social Democrats, Bebel and Liebknecht, who use the Reichstag as a platform, particularly to attack the aggressive nature of the war against France, who make fighting, resolute speeches. Again, the drama of this may to us now seem, rather blasé. It's a long time since anybody in the British Parliament stood up and made a speech that really encapsulated the class struggle. But historically, that has happened. And historically, this was very much the case in those societies where agitations around Parliament were emerging. So Marx and Engels saw Parliament as an important, I think, focus for political activity. They also saw it as a way of gauging strength and support. They saw electoral campaigns operating in that way. Again, famously, when sending letters and communicating with socialists in Germany and in France, they argued that using the ballot, using the right to vote, was a way of demonstrating the strength of the working class movement, but also of developing, I suppose, a sense of confidence and progress and development. So the important role of Parliament there was really in many ways in terms of its immediacy, in terms of its immediate function. How did that fit in with the wider conception of politics? Well, Marx and Engels spent a considerable amount of time in the 1860s and the 1870s arguing against a different conception of politics, particularly represented by Bakunin and an anarchistic trend. That anarchistic trend argued generally for abstention from parliamentary struggle and put focus on economic struggle, particularly the use of strikes and protests of that nature. Now, the argument against this by Marx and Engels, and later in a similar vein in Russia by Lenin, the argument here wasn't in opposition to strikes, it wasn't in opposition to those forms of struggle, but it was in opposition to that being the primary or indeed the sole form of struggle. And I suppose this is again where we come to quite an important, fundamental underlying difference. And I think this is quite significant for contemporary socialists as well. And this is really about how we raise the consciousness and the awareness of the working class. Whether, for example, that develops spontaneously, does it arise out of everyday struggles, the struggles in the workplace? Does it arise from campaigns around immediate issues, which again can take a protest form? Or is it a more sustained campaign, particularly summed up by the ideas of convincing and building a conscious socialist movement? You can see that idea of how consciousness develops is quite a central one for Marxists, and indeed it's going to be an important one and it will be an important theme when we come to discuss the Russian Revolution and the revolutionary movements of the 20th century. Because of course the assumption of spontaneity, the assumption that consciousness can change quite quickly and that this does not necessitate certain forms of political organization and certain forms of political activity is very strong, I think, amongst Bakuninists and amongst anarchists. And also it's quite a strong idea amongst what will be an important current in German social democracy, although paradoxically this is attempts certain deals with the German ruling class, a certain Lassallean current. Again, comrades will remember in some of our earlier sessions on German social democracy the nature of Lassalleanism. So this idea that consciousness will arise spontaneously, that above all that the socialist movement can develop very quickly and that it arises out of immediate struggles, is one that is contested by Marx and Engels in the First International, and also by their co-thinkers and the people who will develop political parties in Europe, particularly in the German Social Democratic Party. And this puts a different emphasis on the need not only for political organization, but a focus on the political, on raising the political level, raising the consciousness, in many ways through what is primarily an educative function. The idea of propagandizing, which in 19th century German doesn't mean what we perhaps would mean. It's actually convincing people about socialism, of studying, and also of organizing. Now, in the case of German social democracy, that becomes then very strongly developed. And again, Ben Lewis's sessions last year looked at the nature of that. And we also saw it to a certain extent when Ben talked about International Women's Day and talked about the nature of women's organization in German social democracy. So this focus then on parliament and this focus on politics in this way is, I think, really quite a different departure and is really very different from that of other currents in the international. And it's one which I think will be established as the model for the Second International, but it will also carry with it, however, some other problems, which I'd like to perhaps address now in terms of how that develops in the 1880s and the 1890s. Marx obviously died in the early 1880s. Engels lived about 15 or so years after him. I think 13 years or so after him. And so Engels was alive for much of the development of socialist movements throughout Europe. And in his writings there, he kept the focus on the need on the political. And in particular, the argument that Marx had put forward in the First International, that the working class must develop its own political strategy and that it must develop its own political awareness. And in both letters and in correspondence, he put a lot of emphasis on this in his dealings in Germany. He also had quite an impact, as Marx had done in the 1870s with the Goethe program, when the two elements of German social democracy came together. But Engels increasingly advocated the use of parliamentary politics, but also in conjunction with the development of a movement outside. So the growth of German social democracy was not simply an abstract growth in votes and not simply a growth in numbers of deputies in the Reichstag. It was also a measure, according to Engels, of growing consciousness, growing awareness, and growing strength. And it's that idea of developing the working class as a conscious political agent through this type of political tactic, which I think is quite important, because it's about raising consciousness. It's about giving the working class a sense of its own potential. It is in the words which Lenin will later pick up and develop in the early 20th century, about merging, about fusing the working class movement, which might be quite elemental, spontaneous is another translation of that, but also with the socialist movement, and bringing those two elements together to have a conscious working class. So Parliament for the German socialists, for the French socialists, has that function. However, it also does contain within it a potential for other forms of politics. And I suppose that when we counterpose Marx's idea that the state machinery cannot be ready-made, it's not a ready-made instrument for us to take power. When we counterpose that to the use of Parliament as a platform, you can see that there might well be tensions, particularly because of revisionist and indeed reformist tendencies in those parties. Those tendencies in Germany in particular, associated with Bernsteinism, are significant. They rest, I think, on a number of quite objective material circumstances. They rest on what Lenin will later call the labor aristocracy. They rest on the more prosperous sections of workers. But they also rest, I think, on an idea that the power of the working class, as seen through Parliament, will force the ruling class to give way. So you can see that the revolutionary kernel of the power of the working class is still nodded to in that argument, but the idea that the ruling class will simply stand aside and that Parliament, from being a platform, will become an instrument is obviously really quite a shift in approach. This meant, for example, that in the struggles inside German social democracy and the struggles that were then echoed in other parties of the Second International, parliamentarianism often then began to be equated with reformism, and indeed as a reaction to the growth of that sort of reformism, the left of social democracy began increasingly to argue that struggle outside of Parliament, and indeed different forms of struggle, for example, the debate in Germany about the general strike, the mass strike, all of these arguments, all of these ideas then became wrapped in the question of Parliament and whether Parliament could be a platform or an instrument. So what had begun in the Marxist movement as a clear objective had when many of these mass parties came into existence, had become in a sense a reformist, not a deviation, but in fact a diversion, and what was seen as a platform for struggle had now simply become a sort of sounding board. And so the relationship between the struggle outside and the creation of mass movements that were designed in a sense to hegemonize, in a sense to establish the political and the cultural and the social dominance of the working class, had really been absorbed into that system. And I suppose much of the criticism of that sort of politics and the idea of parliamentary politics being involved in that did lead to left currents in the socialist movement that rejected Parliament. In the British case, I think we have something that's rather different, and I think that's to do with the development of parliamentary history. It's also to do with the development, I think, of the role of the trade unions in the British Labour movement. Remember that in many of the continental movements, the unions emerged in their modern form, often through the initiatives of socialist and socialist parties, rather than as the other way around. In other words, the Labour Party style of development that we have in this country is fairly unusual. In most European countries, indeed globally, it's a socialist party and a socialist movement that often takes the lead in developing trade unions. So, well, in the case of Britain, reformism had both a different ideological basis. It had a similar material or social basis in terms of the Labour aristocracy, but it also had, I think, the prestige, as it were, of the dominant ideology of British constitutionalism. And Labour, as again we looked at last year, Labour absorbed that ideology really from the beginning. You'll remember I referred to this, Ralph Miliband's book on parliamentary socialism, when he stresses that the British Labour Party was always a constitutional party, and that if there was one thing that it was always committed to, it was constitutionalism. And that, of course, is different, very different from revolutionary parliamentarism that Lenin refers to. Now, I want to, perhaps draw some sort of concluding points, and perhaps take it just a little further on. When Lenin used the phrase revolutionary parliamentarianism, he used that expression in a pamphlet, Left-Wing Communism and Infantile Disorder. He wrote that pamphlet in 1920, and it was an attempt to deal with the experience of the revolutionary and the Marxist movement in Europe, really going back into the 19th century. It was a pamphlet really directed against those elements in the international communist movement, which had formed during and in the years just after the First World War, who were arguing against participation in Parliament. Groups like the Communist Workers' Party of Germany, for example, groups that of left communists who argued that Parliament was a snare and a trap, that in a sense the workers had seen through Parliament, and that might well have been justified in the past, but the experience of social democracy, its portrayals in 1914, and its portrayals moreover in 1918 in Germany, showed that Parliament was a snare, it was a delusion, and that we as revolutionaries, as Marxists, should sort of cut through that. Now, Lenin argues against that, and he doesn't just argue against it, I think, in terms of saying, well, it's a useful vehicle. He doesn't just say, well, why turn down an opportunity to go along and make your case, to mobilize people to take part in elections, to present your program. He doesn't just do it for that reason. He argues that in many ways that the parliamentary experience and the illusions that many people have in bourgeois parliaments as a means of change, he said, still remain. So he pointed out that, for example, that the Bolsheviks after 1905 had taken part in the various Duma that had been elected, even though many of those Duma were clearly anti-democratic, were clearly designed to limit political opposition. But Lenin was very clear that was an important stage, and that indeed, drawing on the arguments of Marx and Engels and the experience of the German SPD, he argued for participation in those parliaments. Although on occasions he also argued for boycotts, and this again is the important point about, I suppose, the tactics, that we might see Parliament as a way of raising a political level, rather than just being an abstract set of principles in this way. If our aim is to build a conscious political subject, to build the working class as a class that is capable of taking power and of building a new society, then Lenin's view was that Parliament was a possible way of doing that. It was an instrument that should be used, not ready-made, but a platform that can be used in that way. But he also pointed to nearer experiences nearer in time, both to European comrades and to his own Bolshevik party. And of course, the experience of the Constituent Assembly, the experience of the early days of the Weimar Republic. The Spartacus had boycotted the elections initially. He argued that the idea of the democratic republic was still valid and was still an important area and an important process that workers had to go through. That there was still, not only were there still illusions, but that the experience of working in Parliament would be part of an important revolutionary process. Now, why this was obviously a controversial point of view, and again, not only left-wing communism, but if you look at the 1921 Communist International and in 22 as well, debates about the relationship of Marxist Parliament, figure very strongly. But of course, the issue was the existence of Soviet power. And what the Russian Revolution had shown was that the Soviets could be new organs and new forms of government. But Lenin isn't arguing against Soviet power and talking for saying that a parliamentary republic is the highest level. He's arguing for Soviet power, but he's arguing that must arise from within a concrete revolutionary situation, and that simply to call for Soviets or even to set up Soviets that don't grow organically out of the struggle, would be a mistake. So the idea of revolutionary parliamentarism, I think, had validity, and indeed I still think it does have validity in those parts of the world where parliaments function and where there is a workers' movement that can put forward those ideas. Because I think the central point that I want to return to are the premises that Marx and Engels established, and Marxists and socialists have continued. And that is that our job is not to reform society. Our job is not gradual change. If that was possible, which I doubt, then it might be worth attempting. Marx again raised the possibilities that there might be a parliamentary road to socialism in a country like Britain or in Holland. But he also laid down the possibility, which he said was more likely, of what he referred to as a slaveholders' revolt, that the ruling class would resist. So Parliament would act as a platform. Parliament would act as a place where we could advance our arguments. It would be a focus of struggle, but we could not divorce that from the idea of the conscious involvement of the working class. Indeed, the working class being the agent of change. So parliamentary socialism doesn't see the working class in that way. One of the issues that Tina raised when we began, and she talked about the Corbyn government and about left-wing governments. Well, we can perhaps get to talk about that in the discussion, and particularly about the debates in the Second International, and indeed in the early years of the Third International, about participation in bourgeois governments. But you can see that if we have a conception of socialism which is democratic, which involves the working class collectively owning the property of society, then we're talking about a much more fundamental change, not only in the way that society is organized, but how that's actually going to be achieved. We are talking about really revolutionary changes in consciousness. And a Labour government operating through Parliament and operating through the established legislative processes is not going to achieve that. So our conception of socialism is radically different from ideas of parliamentary socialism, even of the most left-wing kind. It requires really a revolutionary change in society. It requires a different form of society. And for that, Parliament is an element in the struggle, it's a means in the struggle, but it's not the main way that that's going to be achieved. The historical experience, both of the Russian Revolution, the Paris Commune, and of the socialist movement, is that that struggle will have to be one that involves the majority of society replacing the state machine, smashing the state machine in the translation from Germany, and having new organs and new forms of power. And that's a very different conception of socialism than incremental change, or indeed the ideas of even the most left-wing government instituting change through legislation. So, comrades, Parliament as a platform, not as an instrument, and the focus on the political and the focus on the development of the political subjectivity of the working class as an agent of history, that I think is where Parliament and that focus on the political, that's where it comes from. So, comrades, I'll finish now and we'll move on to questions.
Thank you very much, Kevin. As always, lots of issues raised. I was going to speak first myself, actually, because there's a few questions or comments I think that came up. I think it's a very interesting way you put it, you know, from the development from seeing Parliament as a platform to Parliament as an instrument, i.e. you can use it to achieve socialism. And I definitely agree with you there that that's not possible in general. I mean, in a period like this, in a normal capitalist society, you know, you're not going to be introducing more and more left-wing legislation to get to socialism eventually. Socialism is the conscious act of the organized working class, etc. I think there's slightly different issues around there, though. So in revolutionary periods, perhaps, I mean, perhaps then Parliament could look quite different. You know, Parliament could be 90% Communist Party or something. You know, again, that you know doesn't mean you have to have would you have an act enabling socialism? That's unlikely. But I think things change a little bit. I think in different revolutionary or political periods, etc. I mean, in today's period and the last, 100 years, no doubt, Parliament, sort of in a capitalist society, especially now in a capitalism in decline, you end up, if you go into government, you end up trying to manage capitalism and trying to, shift, very small resources into different areas, especially if you're on a council or something. It strikes me as hell on earth trying to do that kind of job as a councillor, shifting limited resources. And that happens, of course, and it has been happening non-stop in the last 20, 30 years, when you had Die Linke in Germany, Rifondazione Comunista, Syriza, etc. They all thought, we can make a real change, a real difference if we go into government, and we can handle it, we can manage it. And what happens is they have to attack the working class. They have to betray the working class who got them there, and in return, obviously, the working class turns their back on them and doesn't vote for them anymore, obviously. So there's very little, I think, you can achieve, and that kind of is an interesting discussion, isn't it, when it comes to Corbyn and the idea that whereas Marxists 100 years were quite sure Parliament is a platform, use it as a platform to make you make your socialist ideas, etc. You use it to talk to the masses, etc. It's a much better way to reach people, etc. But it's not the be end and all and end all, and you're not going to achieve socialism that way. But in the Labour Party, I have to say, even on the sort of revolutionary left, it's almost, you're almost called a nutcase if you say, do you think it's a really good idea to push for Corbyn to become Prime Minister? Is that we must all strive for a Corbyn government? I mean, that's over now, but it's, or we must, of course we must fight for a Labour government. But what does that achieve in a capitalism in decline? What can you achieve in that situation? And do you not, and especially if a left winger like Corbyn had been on the helm, what could he have achieved? It would have been a class war non-stop. So it would have been very, very difficult to do anything. I think the Lenin experience with the Duma is interesting, and it shows there's flexibility. You always have to keep things under consideration, and you change tactics according to what's going on, which I think is a better way to look at it. Like, I think at the end you kind of made a bit of a strange opposite between our job is not to reform. You can never reform, you can't reform anything, and basically it has to be revolution. But surely if we're like a minority in government, even, you can sometimes achieve reforms. You can push the government, you can reform to make life slightly harder, slightly less hard for people, etc. I mean, these are small reforms. These are not reforms that will necessarily turn, towards socialism. But, surely that's, if you are in Parliament, you don't just use it to talk, but you also, you vote, and you vote for good things, and you put forward, reforms occasionally, etc. I mean, revolutionaries don't always say we're not, we're obviously not reformists, but we do sometimes fight for reforms, and we put them forward to, make life slightly less miserable. Reforms are not the way to socialism. I think we agree there, but I don't think we need to make quite such a big opposition there between reform and revolution. Revolution is the goal, but you can't get there through reformism. But sometimes communists fight for reforms, and we'd probably agree with that. Anyway, Tony is coming in now.
Managed it at last. Okay, thanks. Parliament as an arena or a platform for revolutionary warfare. The last MP I can remember who might be classed as a revolutionary who did that was, and you might remember him, Bernadette Devlin, who tried to scratch the eyes out of the Home Secretary Reginald Maudlin after Bloody Sunday, but I can't remember any revolutionaries since her. I think we have a problem with the Labour Party, and the Labour Party, in the sense, is an electoral machine which only occasionally indulges in politics. It's completely suffused by the electoral rhythm, and that presents, I think, a real problem for socialists anyway. However, the questions that Tina raises are interesting ones. although I don't agree with her conclusions, which is the CPGB analysis. You see, I don't think we can say vote for Corbyn, vote for the left, vote for this MP, but we don't want them to get into government. That actually doesn't really make a great deal of sense on the doorstep or in your campaigning. I think you have to have a program which envisages people on the left, Corbyn or whoever, getting into government, behaving in such a way that they challenge the established power and turn to the working class and to their supporters. Otherwise, there really is no point in the exercise, and it will certainly become an exercise in disillusionment. But we face, of course, a problem that the consciousness of the working class today is minimal compared to the consciousness of the German working class at the beginning of the century. And we have to face that. And we have to ask, I think, why did Marx lay an emphasis on the working class? I mean, the peasantry was certainly as oppressed in many ways, but they weren't alienated from their labor like the working class. But there was an additional element, which was that workers came together in their thousands in the mines and in the docks and the shipyards, and their consciousness grew as a result of that, because they could talk, they worked together, they faced common conditions. I think we have a real problem today, and I don't think there has been this analysis, that the working class has become atomized as a result of information technology, the technological development as a whole, the organization of society, but also a certain conscious strategy amongst the ruling class itself in terms of the gig economy. Our rulers are not stupid. They are far more conscious than the working class itself, and that itself has thrown up problems. So one of the questions I would ask of Kevin is, do you think the working class in Europe today can become a revolutionary class, or has revolutionary potential for the working class been exported to the areas of the world where there are still mass concentrations of workers, where there are big shipyards, steel yards, big factories, China, Hong Kong, etc. And has the role envisaged by Marx for the working class changed, if you like, as part of an international division of labour? Thanks.
Thanks, Tony. Mike, next, please.
Yeah, taking up a couple of points. I think the point that Tina raised about arguing for reforms. I mean, arguing for reform to benefits is one of the ways that we win our spurs in the eyes of the working class, but without actually trying to sow any illusions. But my sort of question is, we talked about the possibility of a Corbyn-esque government, a socialist, a reformist socialist government, with fundamental reforms proposed, which would inevitably, especially in the sort of the period of declining capitalism, which will inevitably attract the opposition of the ruling class, and they will sabotage it at every turn. The question is, do we have to go through that process for the working class to realise that parliamentary reform, or fundamental parliamentary fundamental change, is not achievable through Parliament?
Thank you, Comrade. Kevin, do you want to come in now or leave it a bit? You're muted.
Sorry, Tina, I'll come in. First of all, Tony, you've asked this question before, and I think it's a very important question. The fact that we still are discussing it, and indeed, I think it's an important question about the nature of the contemporary working class. I think that it's very clear that class consciousness is at a low level. Again, a number of comrades who I can see on this call will remember the days of when there was quite widespread class struggle really throughout Europe, indeed throughout the world. And, we all know that that has ebbed. We also know that there have been very important social and economic changes. And, Tony's alluded to many of them. I think that there is still a revolutionary potential for the working class in Europe. And that's because in many ways, the condition facing the working class, for the reasons that Tina said in her comments, still remains dire. There is still, tremendous poverty, inequalities. There's still tremendous social oppression. What I think is different is, of course, consciousness of how that can be changed. And again, the economic changes that we're aware of and the decline of working class organization, but perhaps more importantly, the nature of employment will obviously alter that. However, I think although we're in a new situation in some ways, it also throws up elements that were, quite reminiscent of some of the historic periods. If we think about the organization of the working class in this country, which began to move outside of skilled workers and into unskilled workers, the dockers, general workers and so on, that occurred under employment and other conditions that were in many ways similar to today. We might call it the gig economy, but for me, it's really not much different than the way that people used to hang around certain workplaces, the docks, building sites, and get called in for a day's work. So the development of class consciousness, I think, it's not inevitable that it will remain at a low ebb. The other thing about the development of that consciousness, certainly in Europe historically, was the role of socialists and others in developing that. So that, for example, when the unions were formed in Britain, the general unions, the so-called new unionism of the 1880s and the 1890s, then it was often Marxists and socialists who did that. And indeed, many of those trade unions, the General and Municipal and Boilermakers Union, for example, had within it, a commitment to fundamental change in society. It was actually had a sort of Marxist program inscribed at the head of its materials. And that's because Jenny Marx was important in establishing that. The same with the Union of Women Workers and so on that developed. So while I would agree with what Tony's saying about the changes, and we can't really deny that, I think that the conditions of capitalism will still throw up the possibilities of struggle, and it's really the conscious element, the subjective element, that we need to develop. But of course, Tony's also right, and I think one of the points that is different from, for example, say 100 or more years ago, is that the working class as an international class is actually much stronger. That if we look at the world proletariat, there are now proletariats of hundreds of millions of people in Africa and in Asia. And those workers are facing many of the same conditions that throw up political opposition. So I think that we now live in much more so, even than Marx's time, we live in a world system. And I think that, we have to look at that in that way. I think the other point as well is that the political traditions, the political culture that is an important part of the subjective element in countries like America, but also in the United States, are also an important sort of element. Indeed, they may almost have a material form. So I think that that idea, I think that the European working class is sort of dead, and that the caravans moved on elsewhere. Although there are a lot of things that seem to suggest that, I think that we can still see working class struggles. The European working class is still, much stronger, much more secure than working classes in other parts of the world. But Tony has raised some quite important points, and I think it is an area of discussion, particularly to see the relationship between class struggle and political change. Marx did actually look at other social groups. I think it's wrong to say that he just concentrated on the proletariat, and indeed, both Marx and Engels, and of course Lenin, looked at the role of the peasantry, and in particular the nature of the peasantry in that way. And although they were aware of the problems of revolutionary consciousness amongst peasants, they also had the experience, particularly in Lenin's case, of the way that peasants could form alliances with workers. And in particular, Lenin's argument in Russia that the proletariat would be the leading class, but that this would be in conjunction and a fusion of a variety of struggles. So I think that again we have models for that particular pattern. On Tony's point about electoral politics, I mean he's right that the British Labour Party is someone said it's a crusade or it's nothing. Well, it's an electoral machine, and that really is its be all and end all. And what has become its essential raison d'etre is simply to win elections. And the idea of winning an election because that represents some sort of step forward. Tony sort of criticizes the idea that we shouldn't pin all of our hopes on a Labour government. He says that people, won't understand it. They'll regard what we're saying as crazy. Well, the point is, if we focus on a Labour government, then what we're doing is we're, in a sense, diverting people from what we consider our conception of socialism to be. Because if it is the conscious action of the working class, then merely electing a government, which, as comrades have said, will come under, tremendous pressure, will be subverted and probably overthrown, then that, in a sense, is sowing, I think, more illusions, just to simply say, vote for, the Labour government. We need a form of politics which doesn't reject the use of Parliament as a platform, but actually sees that as only one important focus, and that it's building the movement. In a way, to sort of slightly subvert Bernstein, the movement is everything, but the point is that we need the aim as well. We need a movement, because otherwise we won't be able to achieve our aims. And that's where I think the link between what I think of as the political and the electoral, comes in. Just a quick comment on Tina. I did overlook the question of reform, probably because I was talking more about the historical point. And obviously, if you have parliamentarians, they will be moving legislation, they will be voting, and they will be commenting directly on politics, in that way. And again, the experience of socialist parliamentarians internationally gives examples of that. And yes, Tony, I do remember Bernadette Devlin. In those days, Parliament wasn't broadcast, as you'll know, and it's a shame that we didn't actually see Reginald Maudling getting his comeuppance. Mike, you're right about the about the sabotage that is likely to happen. Indeed, we already saw that in the case of Jeremy Corbyn, by the campaign to undermine him, and indeed the arguments amongst some in the ruling class, in the army and so forth, that they wouldn't obey orders and so on. And of course, the experience of Chile, which you and I both remember very well, shows the nature of a ruling class, even in a supposedly Latin American democracy. Chile was always famous for being one of the more stable democracies in South America, and yet even there, the army, with the backing of the American state, moved against the democratic government. And again, the illusions that Allende and others sowed in the parliamentary road, and in particular the state would simply become an instrument, I think shows this problem. I don't think we can say whether workers have to go through particular stages. I mean, one of the things that is conceivable, I mean, I don't have a crystal ball, but I think it would be possible to build a revolutionary movement that, a mass movement, mass labor movement that is committed to a revolutionary program of transformation. But I think it's probable, from what I can see, certainly in a country like Britain, that some form of parliamentary politics would have to come into that. The experience of the Labour Party as a party historically doesn't encourage us to believe that that socialism through parliament is achievable, and that we would have to, I think, continue to agitate and develop the type of parliamentary politics that I've been talking about. But I wouldn't. I'm not necessarily talking about a sort of schematic pattern, and I think we're at a far too early a stage to argue about that. There were a couple of questions written down which I'll look at, and I'll try and take them up when we get towards the end for the summing up. But I'd like comrades to come in from the floor rather than me just yatter on. So, okay, I'll stop now.
What? Kevin yattering on? Never. There's also quite a lively debate in the chat. So comrades, if you want to come in, please indicate. The next person to speak is Larry.
Got it. Thank you very much. Yeah, on the issue of incremental changes through the parliamentary system, I understand that, and you say that it's not the route to socialism in revolutionary terms, but I think Parliament and the issue of republicanism, which we've been debating through Labour left and Labour parliamentary, Labour, sorry, Republican group, is that there has to be an understanding that that there is a transitional demands from a transitional movement, and this doesn't seem to occur. Although you've hinted at it, Kevin, on a few occasions there, but I've always taken the view, even as a shop steward way back in the 70s, was all our demands on the shop floor were transitional to achieving better working conditions and things like that. So I'd like to see comrades reviewing the idea of transitional demands within the mass movement, if we ever get a mass movement. And I think that the Corbyn project was another example of that. The ebb and flow of ideas within the Labour Party in particular need to be addressed. And I think that the failure of people to understand the transition between success and failure, this is what has led to people leaving the party. They thought that Corbyn was going to bring about some sort of utopia within the movement, and without understanding the transitional stages of the Labour movement and the working class, you're doomed to failure if you can't understand it. Thanks very much.
Thank you. Matthew Jones is next.
Hi, comrades. Sorry, my camera's dying, so sorry about the horrible picture.
It looks the same as always, Matthew, no offense. But
Well, I mean, the thing is, you see, on Monday, we'll all be able to get a haircut here, whereas you guys will have to wait another week. Anyway, so I think it's been very useful. I think, and I think there's various points in here. I don't agree with Tony when he talks about in terms of the working class and its in terms of its atomisation. I mean, sure, there's atomisation of working class, but it still exists, and it still plays a central role. And I agree that actually obviously there is a conscious effort, through particularly the Agency of Finance Capital, which is the most strategically conscious element of capitalism, to get rid of chunks of the manufacturing working class and so on and so forth, and also to break up workforces. I mean, if you work in a large workplace like I do, then you'll find basically they section up the workforce into 20 or 30 different bits using contracts, subcontractors, millions of means of control. And the question is really, so how does the working class and its organisation seek to overcome that? And the problem being, of course, is that the organisations currently, are both politically and in terms of unions and so on, are not capable of it. So it's only a question: how do you step up, particularly politically, to raise the level and take on these questions? I think that the other thing, we also should look at it the other way around in terms of Parliament and elected office. It's an issue. It's an issue for the working class and it's an issue for the left, but it's also an issue for the capitalist class. The capitalists they're not democratic by nature. It's pretty autocratic, and particularly if you look at the structures of the state and councils and so on and so forth in Britain, are pretty autocratic, really. And so you're looking at it and you say, well, okay, it's an issue for them. They're not democratic. And the question is, how do we, because of course they only conceded those democratic institutions, in one form or another, after the working class fought for them over decades and in this country a century or so. How do we use these in order to point to the issues and actually clearly point out that, of course, that these things are don't serve us and are incapable of doing so, and of course serves another power. The capitalists are not there to take up the interests of the working class, and it's then as part of that to say, okay, well, you take a dual strategy of both using these as platforms and at the same time building the workers' organisations, because obviously the power of the working class rests on a completely different set of organisations and a different set of politics than for these people, it's to do that rather than, the thing is that most people, even the left of the Labour Party, don't actually question the nature of the institutions they're trying to get elected to, or what they should be doing in them, other than just basically carrying out orders. And the thing is, I think it's even more fundamental with Corbyn than comrades have come out with. I think there's a number of things in there. One, of course, Corbyn would never have been allowed to be Prime Minister. The right wing of the Labour Party would have refused to allow him to be Prime Minister if he, under the conditions, because obviously the ruling class doesn't see the need to have Corbyn. I think the ruling class is not stupid. They understand perfectly well that Corbyn is a reformist and not a revolutionary, but they're afraid, particularly of the people behind him. But they don't see the need why they should concede to have him in office. Even if he had got into office, then there's no way that he would have actually carried out any of his programme, other than what he was told to do. There's no way in hell, because obviously there's another politics to do it. If you look at, you can look at Syriza, which lasted, a matter of days before, less before it basically collapsed. The Labour Party just wouldn't put up any resistance at all, and you can see it. Even the likes of the changes in terms of the positions taken by Corbyn and McDonnell and so on and so forth. They understood, as reformists, they understood very well. They were only going to be able to do what they were allowed to do. which would have been nothing, basically. So I think that there's a thing, in terms of looking at, how do we utilize these things, particularly in a strategic sense, and how do we see the contradiction, look at contradiction that exists, between the fact that they had to concede democracy under conditions in which the ruling class itself is not democratic, and how do we open that up and make it clear to people as to what that is, try and remove that sort of illusion. But at the same time, as I say, the questions of the power of the working class rests on a completely different set of institutions, its own institutions. And the other thing is, I think the thing is, we now have more proletarians in the world than ever before, billions of them, and therefore, we should be absolutely solid and coherent that we think, and we understand that the working class its job is to liberate humanity from the rot, social rot that we're facing as a capitalism well past its used by date, and something that should have been actually binned a number of decades ago. But this is the job that has been left to us, by history. Thanks.
Thank you, Matthew. Zbigniew, please. Next.
Yes. Call me Zbyszek. I know. It's great to be on this debate, and I think we can now be more positive than I think we've been so far in the debate, because the working class is diverse. It's made up of the struggles of women. It's made up of the struggle of environmentalists like the XR. These are all people, working class struggles. The Black Lives Matter struggles on racism. These are all part of the working class consciousness development. They're all part. Doesn't just take place around the workplace, and it's global. And it's we can go down the supply chains of everything that was on our table, imported from the rest of the world, and look at the number of proletarians, people from all sorts of different classes that have contributed to the food that we eat, the machines that we use, etc. So when we're talking about this, we should look at those struggles and the combined and uneven development across history of those struggles, and learn from the positive advances of decolonization, which is going on now, even in the Israeli state, of settlers refusing to be part of the struggle and helping the Palestinian struggle. So I think that all that has to be integrated now into the analysis of where we are at. And these are the people that are questioning the consciousness of the working class. Thank you.
Thank you, comrade. Felicity, please. Hello. There you are.
Yeah, hi. My problem with the people who seem against having a mass party is that, what do they want? I mean, do they want endless wilderness, or are they hoping that the British people will rise up in mass revolution? I don't quite understand, because I think we need a mass party, and I think we have to go through some form of parliamentarianism to achieve change. I mean, we are in the midst of change at the moment. We're at the same stage or similar stage to the Industrial Revolution, where we have a new revolution taking place. And I think we have opportunities. Okay, we dipped our toe in the water, sorry, with Jeremy Corbyn, and he made many mistakes. But we know things are possible. And you look at all the Black Lives Matter movement, the Kill the Bill movement, so many movements, so much agitation going on, the deprivation, the austerity, it will come together. It's not just, it appears as though it won't, but it will, because we have to make changes. We have to address the climate issue. We have to address inequality. We have so many issues to address. And I really don't think that we can do that with small parties just agitating. Part of the discussion, yes, small parties to be part of the discussion, but I really, really do not see it by leading some form of vanguard. But thank you.
Thank you, comrade. Steve Freeman, please.
There we go. I'm muting myself, yes. Thank you, Tina. I agree with first of all, the first idea I agree with is that Parliament is very, very important. Not because it's going to introduce socialism, but you can achieve reforms through Parliament. I think you can't achieve socialism through it, but these are two different things that could be connected in some way, but they're clearly not the same, and we shouldn't mix up these two questions. Parliament is, for me, a theatre of, or a stage, really, where the class struggle is fought out politically. It's where parties come together and clash, and those parties represent classes. It's a theatre of deceit, a theatre of falseness and lies. But in there, if the working class party should be in there exposing what is going on, because that is part of the struggle between classes. Now, it's not the only place where it takes place. It takes place in workplaces. It takes place in the streets. It takes place in pamphlet wars. It takes place in newspaper fights and all sorts of different manifestations of the class struggle, okay, all over the place. But Parliament is one of the theatres of the class struggle that people take some notice of. And so if we want to try to educate the working class in some way, we have to go into that place, the theatre of lies and deceit, in order to try to expose some of the truth about what is going on as part of educating the working class. Now, that's different from claiming that you can get to socialism this way, but there is a contradiction, I think, that Tony brings out, and Larry points us in the right answer, because there's a contradiction is between communists with a communist program, waging a communist struggle, and participating in Parliament with that program and that struggle, condemning the whole thing from the word go, and being in the Labour Party, whose raison d'etre is to try and improve the lot of the working class. And so we might say, well, you're wasting your time there, but then what are we doing? What, in that case, what are we doing in the Labour Party? Then we didn't agree even with standing candidates or winning elections and things like that. So there's this sort of problem. And I think that Tony and Larry point away, there are reforms that can be won. The question is, do those reforms take us forward, or the way that Larry put it, are they transitional reforms, that through that fight for reforms you can take the whole situation into a different place, or are we just getting minor reforms that really are raising illusions in what can and can't be achieved, and that's actually achieving nothing but disillusioning people as to what we think they can achieve when in fact they can't achieve it. Now, if we ask ourselves, can the working class capture state power through Parliament? I think the answer is, can they get control of the bureaucracy and the military power of the state? I think the answer is no. That only comes about in a revolutionary situation, and we can't conjure up revolutions like we're sort of magicians who could sort of call one up and one will come along next week or something like that. They come out of profound crises in society that we can't control. We don't know. Marxism helped them to predict that Russia would be a place where there would be a revolution. You know, they were all thinking Russia would be a place in the 1880s and 90s because of the contradictions within Russian society that would mean there'd be a contradiction between Tsarism and capitalism, and that would create conditions for revolution. So the strategy in Russia was based on a deep analysis of capitalism and Tsarism in Russia. Now, that doesn't mean to say that in Germany today or in Britain today, we'd be in that same kind of situation. I happen to think that, I happen to think that Britain is a weak link in the European chain. So I think we're in a much more serious situation, if you like, than we're more like Tsarist Russia than we are somewhere else. But that's another argument, because you have to look at the capitalism and the state and the crisis and the constitution, all those other things. So I don't know where that's leading me towards the end. I think you can't conjure up your revolution. I think that it's quite possible that we could participate in a Labour Party in the fight for reforms, participate in Parliament, but tell the truth about Parliament, and show its weaknesses. And at the same time, as Larry goes back to what Larry pointed out, we need some kind of program that takes us forward. Now, this is my last point, that where Republican comes in, and with republicanism, you're coming to the point of saying the present system isn't working very well and we need a new kind of democracy. And I think that is a kind of revolutionary idea in its own sense. It's a democratic and revolutionary idea. And that's I think, somewhere where you could make a case for reforms through the Labour Party that actually have a big impact or could have a big impact on where we're going, because that's exactly the kind of reform that could take the country in a completely different direction. So I think that's where we have to intervene in the Labour Party around that.
Thank you, Steve. Well, that's certainly been a very lively discussion tonight. Kevin, good luck trying to reply to all of these points.
Okay, thanks, Tina. I agree. There's been some quite good points, and you know, it's probably a subject that we should revisit in various forms, and I think we will when we come to look at the sort of history of revolution and counter-revolution in the 20th century. I think really what was at the center of the questions was two issues. One was whether we can, in a sense, build the sort of socialist movement, the movement that's committed to the conscious transformation of society, whether that's possible, whether we have the class forces, whether the working class is still that universal class, and perhaps more importantly, the means to do that, and in particular, the type of demands that we raise and the way that we raise consciousness. And as ever, you know, people have been here before. And one of the reasons why this was primarily an historical talk, but of course, when we look at history, we always, you know, start to move into the present day. Certainly, when Marxists began to develop political parties in the 19th century, they didn't just simply say, what we want is communism. That's it. You know, communism now. They actually raised specific demands. And if you look at the Communist Manifesto, it raises a set of demands. And indeed, in the you know, succeeding parties, there are a series of minimum demands which are the basis to take society forward, to enable the working class to develop as a political force. So Marxists were very aware that you had to develop the consciousness, and they didn't just simply rely upon proletarianization, on the social and economic changes. They built on that. They certainly developed from that. They built in the workplace and in the neighborhoods and so on. And they also drew in wider sections of society. They didn't just reject the peasants as a reactionary mass. They didn't just say that sections of the petty bourgeoisie, the artisan class, where that was relevant in particular countries, they didn't just reject them. They saw that they too suffered oppressions under capitalism and attempted to appeal to them and to show them that there was an alternative. So that the development of that program, that minimum program and the maximum program, which of course is contained in the work of the German Social Democrats and also in the Bolsheviks as well in Russia, you know, it shows that we've got some experience, historical experience in doing that. Felicity raises some quite interesting points, and she did so in the chat, and she did so when she came on face to face. And she talked about, I suppose, being in the wilderness and about the need for a mass party, and in particular the various movements that are developing. And I think again those movements have a certain significance, and they do point to the you know, to the unrest in society. They do point to the possibilities of developing a movement, and we shouldn't ignore those movements in that way. But one of the problems with what I might refer to as sort of movementism is that those movements are often not particularly anchored in, I think, a general and above all a universal politics. What Marxists did in particularly in Russia, but in other countries as well, was to point out that the oppressions of particular groups were the product of capitalism, they were the product of the autocracy, they were a product of the nature of the current form of society. And they argued that the struggle for democratic reforms, the struggle for socialism, the struggle for transformation drew in all of those various struggles. So my argument about the movements that you describe, and we could go back over the course of my lifetime and see countless movements of this type, is that they need really to be linked to the universal project of emancipation, which I think still focuses on the working class, on the proletariat globally, and on a much wider transformation. Now, the question is, how do we as small groups of Marxists and as socialists who are trying to build that movement, how do we do that? And I think that the argument about being in the wilderness, I'm not advocating, for example, that we turn inward and we sort of retain almost some sort of sectarian purity. We have to go out and we have to build, I think, a mass party. We have to, build a socialist movement. I'm not denying that. But the question is on which it will be built. And I'm afraid the historical experience of those movements which just simply disintegrate or indeed fail to achieve anything is that if they're not built on fairly clear principles, if they're not built on a fairly committed program of conscious change, then they're not really going to lead anywhere. And history does teach us, I think, on occasions, and that experience is quite important. So the need for clarity, the need for program, and the need for, I think, a party that is clearly committed to that transformation is, I think, quite central. In many ways, the current crisis of politics, which Matthew and Zbigniew referred to in various ways, does turn on that particular point. We do live in an historical period of transition. Comrades are talking about, we're all the sorts of opportunities that exist, and that's true. They talk about social and economic changes, but those social and economic changes are not, I think, comparable to the Industrial Revolution, because that was in a period of capitalist expansion. We're now in a period of capitalist decline. We're in a transitional period. We're in a period in which capitalism is overripe for transformation. Marxist Lenin suggested that period of ripeness, as well, as it were, began around about 1870. And probably, if we look at the First World War, we could argue that what that shows, that imperialist war shows that capitalism couldn't take society forward. And so we're, in a sense, the historical problem we have is that capitalism can't take society forward. We know all of the problems. I don't need to tell comrades here, about the problems of poverty and destitution, the problems of the climatic issue, the problems of the inequalities of wealth. Capitalism has given us the potential, has given us the resources for the transformation of society. It's possible, but it's actually the case of the political direction. And so we are in that transitional period, and that what is missing are, I think, the conscious socialist movement that's going to take that forward. And I don't think that it's inevitable that we will constantly face defeats, but we certainly will face defeats unless we can build a movement of that sort. And I suppose if we want to really reduce it to the phrase that Engels developed, but Luxemburg took up because of the situation of the First World War, the question of socialism or barbarism is now, I think, really being played out. Both Steve and Larry made, I think, some relevant points about consciousness raising, but I think that the issue, I mean, I think this is worthy of another discussion on, and I think, obviously this will continue, is the question of how we raise consciousness. And one of the problems with the transitional method, as I've seen it developed, is that it does not, I think, act as the bridge in the way that people suggest. That often it does not, when it's put forward in the ways that, I've seen other comrades in the movement advance so-called transitional demands, is it's not really linked to the transformation of society. So, for example, Steve is right when he talks about, about republicanism, and I'm very keen on that as an idea, and particularly because it points to the nature of political power in society. But it has to be linked to not just a critique. The Republic is an important demand, but it needs to be linked to a much wider transformation. And I think often the transitional method stops and doesn't act as that bridge. That in its own way, the criticisms that were made of the minimum program of German social democracy becoming the maximum program, I think can often be raised in terms of the way that transitional politics are put forward. But I think the idea of what the sort of demands are and the relationship between the minimum and the maximum program and the transitional program, I think is an important one, and I hope it will come out in some of the sessions that are ahead. I'd like to just talk a little bit about the reform question, which I left off partly because I was thinking more about the debates in the 19th century on Parliament and on politics. But I think Matthew and Tina are both, and Steve as well to a certain extent, have both talked about the way that reforms can be won, and they can be won through struggle. And indeed, that if we had a large socialist party and a large socialist movement, then we would agitate for example, the ending of the monarchy. We would agitate for particular reforms and changes. And indeed, the experience even of social democratic parties in the years before the First World War, and indeed of communist and socialist parties in the interwar period, often did suggest that it was possible to mobilize and indeed raise consciousness through the struggle for reforms. So my argument is not one of simply just agitating and persuasion. It is an argument for struggle, but above all, it's an argument of trying to build a conscious movement, a movement that has a clear program, and above all, one that points the way to the power of the working class. And I think that lies through the use of Parliament as a platform. Steve's points about the theatre of deceit, but it's also possible to turn the tables. And the use of all sorts of institutions to do that is all about raising the consciousness of the working class, because our conception of socialism is one that involves and means that the working class actually is governing society. It's not a case of the working class as a passive set of bystanders while the revolutionary elite or the vanguard take power. We do need advanced workers, to use the Lenin phrase. We do need people who can act as leaders, who can argue in their workplaces, in their Labour Party branch, in wherever they're functioning. We do need that. But above all, if our conception of socialism is to have any validity, then it has to be a democratic one. It has to rest upon the mass of the proletariat. It has to rest upon the idea that the workers can take control of society. It's a fundamentally different conception It's a long way from simply a vote every 5 years and allowing politicians to get on with it. It's a radical break from that. And that means that we have to really argue in a revolutionary way. We have to argue for a fundamental change. And that, again, is challenging, you know, the general view in society. You know, it isn't just a case of saying, let's have £15 in an hour for workers. Let's, create more jobs. It isn't, and those things are important, but it's actually arguing that we cannot have a decent life and we cannot have a decent future unless we replace capitalism with socialism, unless we replace the anarchy of capitalism with the rule of the working class. And that is essentially what I'm driving at. We're talking about how to achieve that and how the history of our movement shows the best ways to argue and build a movement for that. But the history of our movement also shows the mistakes that have been made and the dead ends that that's led to. And indeed, when we come to look at the history of the 20th century, not just dead ends, but absolutely horrific counter-revolutions, mass murder, and indeed pretty well near barbarism when it comes to the totalitarian dictatorships that emerge in Europe in the period between the wars. So I'll conclude there, comrades, and I think I've got a few points to make about the new programme, but thanks very much. I've enjoyed the discussion tonight, and I look forward to seeing you again, particularly to remind you about tomorrow evening's session with Tony continuing his history of Zionism, which has prompted a lot of discussion. It's been a very useful session. So I'll be chairing that tomorrow, and Tony will be along, and we can continue the discussion.
Thank you, comrades. Thank you, Kevin.